The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, muffling the world beneath a soft, endless white. It was the kind of winter that clung to the bones, where the cold didn't just bite, but settled deep, making every breath feel slower, every step heavier. The sky, an unbroken stretch of dull gray, hung low over the town, pressing down like the weight of something unseen. It was January, the dead of winter, and everything moved at a different rhythm, slower, quieter, as if waiting for something. Lena had lived in the town all her life. It wasn't the kind of place people moved to. It was the kind they left, disappearing into cities where the snow didn't trap you inside for months on end. But she stayed, tethered by familiarity, by obligation, by something she couldn't quite name. The town, with its old buildings and empty streets, was as much a part of her as the air she breathed. She worked at the library, a small, outdated building on the edge of town where the heater never quite worked, and the smell of old books mixed with the ever-present scent of melted snow. It wasn't a glamorous job, but she liked it. There was a quiet to it, a routine that made sense. Mornings were spent restocking shelves, answering the occasional question from the handful of regulars who still came in. Afternoons stretched into evenings, with Lena sitting behind the front desk, flipping through a book she'd already read a dozen times, listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights above. She lived alone in a small apartment just a few blocks away, a second-floor unit in a building that had seen better days. The pipes knocked in the walls at night, and the wind whistled through the old window frames. But it was home. Her routine was simple. Work, grocery runs, to the only store still open past 7. Cups of tea sipped in front of the window while watching the streetlights flicker against the snow. Some nights, she'd bundle up and take a walk, her boots crunching against the ice, her breath curling into the night air. It was always quiet, too quiet sometimes. The town itself felt like it was holding its breath in the winter months. The tourists stopped coming after Christmas. The lake froze over, and the trees stood like blackened skeletons against the sky. The main street, once lined with cheerful holiday lights, now looked abandoned, the decorations left hanging but unlit, forgotten. Most people stayed inside, their windows glowing faintly in the dark, a reminder that life still existed beyond the cold. Tonight was no different. Lena locked up the library at precisely 8 p.m., wrapping her scarf tighter around her neck as she stepped outside. The cold hit immediately, sharp and biting, creeping into the gaps of her coat. The streets were empty, the kind of emptiness that felt unnatural, like the whole town had simply ceased to exist the moment she turned the key in the lock. She started walking home, her boots leaving a trail of prints in the untouched snow. The streetlights buzzed faintly, casting long shadows that stretched across the sidewalk. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound carrying strangely in the heavy air. It was just another night, another walk home, just like always. The air felt heavier than before, a thickness settling in that had nothing to do with the cold. Lena walked briskly, her gloved hands buried deep in her pockets, her breath forming small, rhythmic clouds in front of her. The streets were empty, as they always were at this hour, but tonight there was something different about it, something she couldn't quite name, a kind of stillness that stretched too far, like the world around her was waiting for something. She glanced up at the windows of the buildings she passed, expecting the usual glow of warm lights, the faint flicker of a television behind drawn curtains. But many of them were dark more than usual. The ones that were lit curtains weren't fully closed, leaving thin gaps of dim, unmoving light. In one of the apartments across the street, a single lamp illuminated a chair positioned awkwardly near the window. There was no sign of movement inside, no silhouette of someone reading or passing by. Just the chair, facing out, as if it were watching the street. Lena looked away quickly, shaking off the unease creeping up her spine. It was nothing, just the winter making everything feel more lifeless than it really was. She picked up her pace, her boots crunching steadily against the snow. The sound was soothing, grounding, until she realized it wasn't the only sound. A second set of footsteps, faint but deliberate, followed just behind her. She stopped. The sound stopped too. Turning her head slightly, she scanned the street over her shoulder. Nothing. The sidewalk behind her was untouched, smooth except for her own tracks. She let out a slow breath and started walking again, her ears tuned to every noise, every shift in the air. The footsteps returned, this time more distinct. They weren't echoing hers, but moving slightly out of sync, just enough to make her pulse quicken. She stopped again. Silence. The same, untouched snow. Her mind raced for a rational explanation. Maybe she was hearing things, the cold playing tricks on her. Sound traveled strangely in winter. She knew that. Still, her hands clenched tighter inside her pockets as she resumed walking, this time forcing herself not to listen too closely. Her apartment was only a few blocks away. Almost there. But as she rounded the corner onto her street, she felt it again. That strange, stretched-out stillness. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows across the pavement, and something about them seemed wrong, like they were flickering out of rhythm, pulsing too slowly, as if struggling to stay lit. The wind had stopped. The air was thick, unmoving. Then she saw it, just ahead, in the small alleyway between two buildings. Someone stood, not moving, not shivering against the cold, just standing, half obscured by the shadows. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't see a face, only the shape, tall, motionless, barely distinguishable from the dark. It was as if they had been there the whole time, waiting. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Lena blinked, and the alley was empty. Her heart hammered in her chest, her breath suddenly too loud in the silence. She forced herself to take a step forward, then another. It was nothing, just a shadow, just a trick of the light. Still, she didn't look toward the alley again as she reached the front door of her building, her fingers shaking slightly as she unlocked it. She stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind her. She didn't turn on the lights right away. For a moment, she just stood there in the darkness, listening. Outside, the night remained unnervingly still. The apartment felt colder than it should have. Lena stood just inside the door, her breath slowing, ears straining against the silence. The room was dark, but she could see the faint outline of her furniture. Her couch, the small table near the window, the coat rack by the door. Everything was where it should be. And yet, something was wrong. The kind of wrong that settled deep in her gut, tightening with every second that passed. She reached for the light switch. Click. Nothing. She flicked it again. The bulb remained dark. Her pulse quickened as she stepped further inside, closing the door behind her with a quiet click. The air inside felt thick, almost damp, as if the cold had seeped into the very walls. She exhaled, her breath visible even indoors. The heater must have shut off. That had to be it. A power outage, a perfectly normal explanation. She moved cautiously through the apartment, feeling her way along the wall until she reached the small kitchen. The digital clock on the stove was dark. No power. But then, why was the fridge humming? A deep, low vibration, barely audible, like something lurking just beneath the surface of silence. Lena hesitated. The noise wasn't coming from the fridge, it was coming from somewhere deeper in the apartment. She turned toward the hallway that led to her bedroom. The darkness there felt different, thicker, heavy, like something was waiting just beyond the reach of her vision. She swallowed, her throat dry. Then, movement. A slow, deliberate shift in the shadows. Not the kind made by shifting light or the tricks of tired eyes. This was something real, a shape that had not been there before. Lena's breath caught. It was standing in the hallway, tall, unmoving, watching. She couldn't see its face, only the silhouette against the darkness, its form blending too seamlessly with the shadows, like it was part of them, like it had been waiting for her to notice. She took a step back. It took a step forward, her body locked in place, every instinct screaming at her to run. But the moment she moved, the shape moved too. Not fast, not sudden, just steady, closing the space between them inch by inch. Her back hit the counter. Nowhere to go. The shape reached the edge of the hallway. And then it spoke. A whisper. Low, breathy. Too close. You left the door open. Lena's stomach dropped, because the door behind her was still locked. Lena couldn't breathe. The whisper coiled around her like smoke, sinking into her skin, wrapping tight around her ribs. She didn't turn toward the door. She couldn't. The thing in the hallway was still there. She could feel it, its presence pressing against the edges of reality. Something too still, too wrong. Her fingers gripped the edge of the counter behind her, knuckles turning white. The lights flickered once, a weak, dying pulse. For the briefest moment, she saw more than just a shadow. It wasn't a person. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if listening. The air around it seemed to ripple, like heat rising off asphalt, distorting the shape into something fluid, shifting. It was there and not there, solid and transparent all at once. The whisper hadn't come from its mouth, because there was no mouth. Lena's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. She needed to move. Now. Slowly, she inched to the side toward the narrow gap between the counter and the living room. The thing didn't follow. Not right away. It only stood there, waiting, watching. And then, as she took another step, the door behind her clicked. Not the sound of a lock disengaging, the sound of it unlocking. A cold wave of realization crashed over her. Her stomach twisted, nausea rising. The thing hadn't been warning her. It had been telling her. She had locked the door when she came in. So, who had unlocked it? A slow creak echoed through the room as the door behind her edged open, inch by inch, revealing nothing but the yawning blackness beyond. Lena didn't turn around. She couldn't. The whisper came again, closer this time, breath against her ear. You left it open. The lights went out,